The first thing I heard that morning was the roar of a diesel engine echoing across Alder Creek Lake. It didn't belong there. The forest around the lake was usually quiet at that hour, broken only by wind moving through the pine trees or the distant cry of birds. But this sound was different. It was loud, heavy, mechanical. The vibration traveled through the steering wheel of my truck as I turned slowly onto the narrow gravel road leading to my property. At first, I assumed it was construction somewhere deeper in the woods, maybe a neighbor clearing trees. But then I noticed the dust rising above the tree line directly ahead of me. My stomach tightened before I even reached the clearing. When the road curved around the last bend, I saw it. A massive yellow bulldozer sat exactly where my wooden lake house should have been. The steel tracks had already crushed half of the front porch. Before I could even process what I was seeing, the blade surged forward again. Cedar beams snapped with a sickening crack as the front wall collapsed. My $200,000 cabin folded inward like a pile of matchsticks. I don't remember opening the truck door. I only remember the moment my legs gave out beneath me. I dropped to my knees in the gravel driveway, staring at the place where my house had stood only minutes earlier. Dust filled the air and pieces of wood slid down into the mud. But the worst part wasn't the destruction. The worst part was the laughter behind me. When I turned around, I saw my mother standing near the edge of the trees, calmly holding up her phone and recording me cry. My name is Madison Clark. I was 31 years old that morning, working as a local television host in Oregon. 2 years earlier, I had spent nearly every dollar I had saved to buy that small property beside Alder Creek Lake. It wasn't a mansion or a luxury retreat. The house was a simple wooden cabin built from cedar and reclaimed timber, sitting on nearly 2 acres of forest and shoreline. For me, it was something far more important than real estate. It was the first thing I had ever truly owned by myself. After long weeks spent in bright studios and noisy newsrooms, the cabin was the place where I could breathe again. I had chosen that property very carefully. The shoreline along Alder Creek was one of the quietest places I had ever found. Migratory birds passed through every spring, nesting in the reeds along the edge of the water. When I first bought the land, several people suggested clearing part of the forest to build something larger. I refused. I kept the trees exactly where they were and designed the cabin so that it blended into the landscape rather than replacing it. Most weekends I spent there alone, drinking coffee on the porch at sunrise and watching herons glide across the lake. Now that porch was nothing more than broken planks scattered across the mud. The bulldozer engine finally shut down with a low metallic rumble, and the dust slowly began to settle across the clearing. I pushed myself up from the gravel, my hands still shaking, and walked toward the ruins. Each step felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's nightmare. That was when I saw the 2 figures standing a short distance away. My mother, Diane Clark, was still holding her phone up, the camera pointed directly at me. She wore a wide smile that looked completely out of place beside the wreckage of my home. Standing next to her was my older sister, Patricia Whitmore. She wore dark sunglasses and a tailored coat, looking more like she had stepped out of a business meeting than a construction site. Neither of them seemed the least bit disturbed by what had just happened. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking as I looked from them to the bulldozer. "That's my house." Patricia removed her sunglasses slowly and glanced over the collapsed structure like she was inspecting a renovation project. "It was your house," she said calmly. "Not anymore." I stared at her, certain I had heard wrong. What does that even mean? My mother finally lowered her phone just enough to speak. "You're being dramatic again, Madison," she said with a small laugh. "The land belongs to Patricia now." For a moment, I couldn't even respond. The words didn't make sense. "That's impossible. I hold the deed to this property." Patricia gestured casually toward the bulldozer. "Not anymore," she replied. "We handled the paperwork yesterday. The county already approved everything." My chest tightened as I looked back toward the machine parked beside the shattered remains of my cabin. The operator had begun pushing broken boards and pieces of drywall away from the foundation, clearing space for whatever Patricia planned next. Each movement of the steel blade dragged debris closer to the edge of the lake. The cabin was outdated anyway, Patricia continued, her voice almost bored. I'm having the entire lot cleared this week. I'm bringing in an architect to design a modern lake house. Infinity pool, glass walls, private dock, something that actually fits the property. My mother laughed again beside her. And don't worry, she added. You can visit whenever you want. I barely heard her. My eyes were locked on the bulldozer blade as it scraped across the muddy ground near the shoreline. The machine pushed a pile of broken wood toward the reeds at the water's edge, flattening the vegetation in seconds. And suddenly, through the shock and anger pounding in my chest, a single memory surfaced in my mind. When I bought this land, there had been a clause buried deep in the property documents. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than routine environmental paperwork. But watching the bulldozer tear through the edge of Alder Creek Lake, I realized something my family clearly didn't know. The shoreline they were destroying wasn't just part of my land. It was protected. I stared at the broken remains of my cabin, trying to convince myself that I had misunderstood what Patricia had just said. The words kept echoing in my head. The land belongs to Patricia now. It sounded absurd, like some ridiculous joke, but the bulldozer sitting in the middle of my living room proved otherwise. My hands were shaking as I stepped closer to them, gravel crunching under my boots. Show me the paperwork, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. If you think this land belongs to her, then show me the deed. My mother tilted her head as if I had just asked something unreasonable. Diane Clark had always been able to dismiss my concerns with a calm smile, the same one she used when she wanted a conversation to end before it became inconvenient. Madison, you really don't need to make this harder than it already is, she said lightly. Everything has already been handled. Patricia stepped forward and pulled a folded stack of papers from the pocket of her coat. She held them loosely in one hand like they were proof of something obvious. The county planning office processed the transfer yesterday afternoon, she said. The demolition permit was approved at the same time. The old structure needed to be cleared before construction begins. I reached for the papers instinctively, but she pulled them back before I could touch them. The small movement made my stomach twist with anger. You're lying, I said. I never signed anything transferring this property. Patricia shrugged as if my objection meant nothing. You must have forgotten, she replied. We talked about this months ago. Mom and I agreed it made more sense for the land to stay within the family and actually be used. Behind her, my mother raised the phone again, still filming. Exactly, she added cheerfully. You're always busy with your television work in the city. That cabin sits empty half the time. Patricia actually has plans for the place. The bulldozer engine rumbled back to life behind me, cutting through the conversation like thunder. I turned just in time to see the blade push another section of collapsed cedar wall away from the foundation. Splinters scattered across the ground as the operator cleared space where my living room had been. Dust drifted through the clearing and settled across the pine needles like gray snow. How did you even get a demolition permit? I demanded, turning back toward them. The county doesn't issue those without the owner present. My mother's smile widened slightly, as if she had been waiting for that question. We have friends in the planning department, she said casually. One of them helped move things along. Since the property was being transferred within the family, there was really no reason for them to slow the process down. The way she said it made my skin crawl. It sounded like she believed the entire situation was perfectly normal. Patricia stepped past me and gestured toward the bulldozer. You should try to look at the bigger picture here, she said. That old cabin was never worth the land it sat on. I'm building something much better. What exactly are you building? I asked. Her expression brightened instantly, the way it did when she talked about impressing people. A modern lake house, she said. Glass walls, concrete structure, infinity pool overlooking the water. It's going to be incredible. My husband already has investors interested in seeing the property once construction starts. The word investors caught my attention immediately. Over the past year, I had heard quiet rumors about Patricia's husband losing money in a series of failed real estate ventures. Suddenly, her urgency made more sense. You're using my land to save his business, I said quietly. Patricia's smile faded for a split second before returning. I'm using family land to create something valuable, she corrected. Something you never had the vision to do. My mother stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on Patricia's shoulder. The family shares its wealth, she said firmly. You should be proud that your sister is turning this place into something important. I looked past them toward the bulldozer again. The operator was now pushing piles of broken wood and drywall away from the center of the lot, clearing the area where Patricia's mansion would supposedly stand. With each pass of the machine, debris slid closer to the edge of Alder Creek Lake. The steel tracks rolled over the soft soil near the shoreline, leaving deep grooves in the mud. Reeds bent and snapped under the weight of the machine. For a moment, I stopped listening to anything my mother or sister were saying, because suddenly something felt wrong. Not just morally wrong, legally wrong. I watched the bulldozer blade push a pile of debris toward the waterline and felt a strange chill run through me. The muddy bank of Alder Creek looked exactly the way it had the day I first visited the property before buying it. And that memory brought another one with it. A stack of documents at the closing table. A county environmental officer explaining something about protected shoreline. At the time, I had barely paid attention. Now, watching the bulldozer grind through the vegetation near the lake, I remembered the exact phrase that had been written in bold across one of those pages. Federal Conservation Agreement. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers suddenly steady. If I was remembering correctly, the shoreline Patricia was tearing apart wasn't just private land. It was protected. I stepped away from them without another word and walked toward the edge of the clearing, pulling my phone out of my pocket. My heart was still racing, but my mind had suddenly become very clear. I opened the document folder where I kept digital copies of every paper I had signed when I bought the property. The screen flickered as I scrolled through the files. Purchase agreement, property survey, environmental disclosure. Then I saw the one I was looking for, the Federal Conservation Agreement. I opened the file and stared at the text for a few seconds just to be sure I wasn't misremembering anything. The document had been signed at the closing 2 years earlier. At the time, the realtor had explained it quickly, saying the shoreline around Alder Creek Lake fell under a federal wetland protection program. The agreement limited construction near the water and prohibited certain types of environmental disturbance without federal approval. I remembered nodding and signing the paper without thinking too much about it. Now those words looked very different. Behind me, the bulldozer roared again as the operator pushed another pile of debris toward the lake. I turned just in time to see chunks of broken wood sliding down the muddy slope toward the reeds. The heavy steel tracks rolled over the wet soil, flattening plants that had been growing there for years. I walked back toward my mother and Patricia, holding the phone in front of me. "Do you know what this land actually is?" I asked. Patricia glanced at the screen briefly and shrugged. "It's lakefront property," she said, "which is exactly why it deserves something better than that old cabin." I shook my head slowly. "No, the shoreline is protected wetland. That entire strip along the lake falls under federal conservation law." My mother laughed again, the same dismissive sound that had followed almost every serious conversation in our family. "Madison, please," she said. "Every lake has some environmental rule attached to it. That doesn't mean construction can't happen." I looked past them toward the bulldozer again. The machine had moved even closer to the water now. Its blade scraped across the muddy ground as the operator tried to clear a flat surface near the shore. "It means something when heavy equipment starts tearing up the wetland," I said quietly. Patricia crossed her arms. "You're overreacting again," she replied. "We already have the demolition permit. Everything here is legal." "You don't have federal approval," I said. She rolled her eyes. "We don't need federal approval. The county approved the permit yesterday." My stomach tightened as I realized they truly didn't understand what they had just done. "The county doesn't control this shoreline," I said. "The federal government does." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Patricia gave a small laugh. "You're bluffing," she said. "You're trying to scare us because you're upset about the house." I turned my phone around and showed her the highlighted section of the conservation agreement. The language was simple and very clear. Mechanical disturbance of the protected wetland area without federal authorization could result in severe civil and criminal penalties. Patricia barely glanced at the screen before waving it away. "Paperwork always looks dramatic when lawyers write it," she said. "But the reality is much simpler. The land is mine now and the construction is already underway." Behind us, the bulldozer blade dropped again with a heavy metallic clang. The operator pushed a mound of debris toward the shoreline, sending a wave of mud sliding into the reeds. Water splashed as pieces of wood rolled down the bank. My chest tightened as I watched it happen. The destruction of my cabin had already felt unbearable. But now, the machine was tearing into something even more serious: the protected wetland. "You need to stop that machine right now," I said, turning back toward Patricia. She didn't even look at the bulldozer. "It's staying right where it is. If the shoreline is disturbed any further, it becomes a federal environmental violation." My mother sighed loudly like she was tired of listening. "Madison, you're embarrassing yourself," she said. "This is a family decision. No one is calling the government over something this small." I looked at her for a long moment. The phone was still in her hand, pointed toward my face as she recorded everything. Then I looked back at the bulldozer tracks carved deep into the wet soil beside the lake. Suddenly, the choice felt very simple. I turned away from them and opened the phone dialer. "Who are you calling?" Patricia asked sharply. I didn't answer right away. My eyes stayed fixed on the number displayed on the conservation agreement, the Federal Environmental Protection Hotline. My thumb hovered over the screen for one brief second before I pressed the call button. Because if my family believed I would stay silent just to keep the peace, they had clearly forgotten one thing about me. I had already signed a federal agreement promising to protect this land. The phone rang twice before someone answered. A calm voice introduced itself as a Federal Environmental Reporting Center. I stepped a little farther away from my mother and sister so the bulldozer engine wouldn't drown out my words. "My name is Madison Clark," I said quickly. "I'm calling about an active destruction of protected wetland near Alder Creek Lake. Heavy equipment is currently operating on the shoreline." For a moment, there was silence on the line as the operator began typing. "Can you confirm the county and coordinates of the property?" the voice asked. I opened the property file on my phone and read the details directly from the conservation agreement. The operator asked several more questions. Was the disturbance mechanical? Was soil being pushed into the water? Were construction crews still active on site? "Yes," I said, glancing toward the bulldozer again. "A large bulldozer is clearing debris and pushing material toward the shoreline right now." The operator paused again. "Do you have reason to believe the activity was approved by federal environmental authorities?" "No," I replied, "and I'm the legal owner of the property." Another pause followed, longer this time. Then the voice on the line changed slightly, becoming more serious. "Thank you for reporting this, Ms. Clark. Please remain at a safe distance from the machinery. Federal agents will be notified immediately." The call ended a moment later. I lowered the phone slowly, feeling the quiet weight of what I had just done. When I turned back toward the clearing, Patricia was watching me with open irritation. "You actually called someone," she said. "Yes." My mother laughed again, though it sounded slightly forced this time. "Madison, the federal government isn't going to show up because you're upset about a construction project." "I didn't call because I'm upset," I said. "I called because you're destroying protected land." Patricia shook her head like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're going to regret this tantrum," she said. "Once the paperwork clears, the county will confirm the transfer and the demolition permit. Then all you've done is waste everyone's time." Behind us, the bulldozer roared again as the operator continued working. The machine scraped across the muddy ground near the shoreline, flattening another patch of reeds. Broken boards from my cabin slid into the shallow water as the blade pushed debris farther down the bank. The sound of cracking vegetation made my stomach twist, but I forced myself to stay calm. "How long until the house design is finished?" my mother asked Patricia casually, as if the entire situation had already been settled. "About 3 weeks," Patricia replied. "The architect wants to survey the cleared lot before finalizing the structure. We're planning a large glass exterior facing the lake." She turned toward the bulldozer and raised her voice. "Make sure the shoreline is completely cleared," she shouted to the operator. "We'll need room for the dock." The man inside the machine gave a brief wave and pushed the blade deeper into the mud. I watched the steel tracks sink into the soft ground near the waterline. Thick grooves spread across the wet soil, filling with dark water almost immediately. My phone buzzed in my hand a few minutes later. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. "Ms. Clark?" a man's voice said when I answered. "Yes." "This is Special Agent Daniel Reyes with Federal Environmental Enforcement. We received your report regarding activity at Alder Creek Lake. Are the machines still operating?" I glanced at the bulldozer again. "Yes, they're clearing the shoreline right now." There was a brief pause as he processed the information. "Understood. Our team is on the way. Please stay where you are." The call ended quickly after that. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked toward Patricia again. She had returned to discussing construction details with my mother, completely unconcerned about the damage still happening beside the lake. Minutes passed slowly. The bulldozer continued tearing across the ground, pushing debris into piles while its steel tracks carved deeper lines into the wetland soil. Then, faintly at first, I heard another sound in the distance. Engines. Multiple engines. Patricia noticed it a moment later and turned toward the forest road. "What is that?" The noise grew louder quickly. Through the trees, dark vehicles appeared on the gravel road leading toward the clearing. Dust rose behind them as they approached at high speed. 3 black SUVs burst through the final curve and rolled into the open space beside the demolished cabin. The bulldozer engine shut down immediately. Doors opened almost at the same time. Several people stepped out wearing dark jackets marked with federal insignia. And suddenly, the quiet forest clearing no longer felt like a construction site. It felt like the beginning of an investigation. The black SUVs rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust, their engines idling for only a moment before the doors swung open. Several federal agents stepped out, moving with calm precision across the clearing. Their jackets carried bold federal insignia across the chest, and their attention immediately shifted toward the bulldozer tracks cutting through the shoreline. The quiet forest suddenly felt tense, like the air itself had changed. The bulldozer operator climbed down from the machine slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans while staring at the approaching agents. He looked confused more than anything else, glancing between the heavy equipment and the strangers now walking toward him. One of the agents raised a hand and gestured for him to stay where he was. Patricia stepped forward immediately, her posture stiff but controlled. "Can I help you?" she asked sharply, clearly trying to take control of the situation before anyone else spoke. A tall man with short dark hair stopped a few feet away from her and pulled a badge from his jacket pocket. "Special Agent Daniel Reyes," he said. "Federal Environmental Enforcement. We received a report regarding illegal disturbance of protected wetlands at this location." For the first time that morning, Patricia looked slightly uncertain. "There must be some mistake," she replied quickly. "We have a county demolition permit for this structure. Everything here has been approved." Agent Reyes didn't respond right away. His eyes had already shifted toward the shoreline where deep bulldozer tracks had carved through the wet soil. Another agent walked past him toward the water's edge, crouching near the flattened reeds to take photographs with a small digital camera. "This shoreline is part of a federally protected wetland," Reyes said calmly. "Mechanical disturbance without federal authorization is a serious violation." Patricia folded her arms. "Like I said, we have a permit." "That permit was issued by the county," Reyes replied. "The county does not override federal environmental protection law." Behind him, 2 more agents began walking along the edge of the clearing, documenting the churned soil and scattered construction debris. One of them pointed toward the muddy slope where pieces of my cabin had already slid into the water. I stepped forward then. "I'm the one who called," I said quietly. Reyes turned toward me. "You're Ms. Clark?" "Yes, I own this property." He nodded once, then glanced briefly at the collapsed remains of the cabin. "Can you confirm that you authorized this demolition?" "No," I said. Patricia cut in immediately. "The property was transferred to me yesterday," she said, reaching into her coat again. "We already submitted the paperwork to the county planning office." She unfolded the same stack of documents she had shown me earlier and handed them toward the agent. Reyes accepted the papers and scanned them briefly. His expression didn't change, but I noticed the way his eyes paused on the signature line. "Where was this signed?" he asked. Patricia hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "At the county office." Reyes looked up from the document and studied her face carefully. "And the original owner signed this transfer voluntarily?" "Of course," Patricia said quickly. I didn't say anything. I simply watched him hand the document to another agent standing beside him. Meanwhile, the bulldozer operator had begun explaining something nervously to one of the investigators near the machine. He gestured toward Patricia while describing how his company had been hired for the demolition project that morning. A second agent returned from the shoreline carrying a camera. "Significant soil displacement along the wetland boundary," he reported. "Debris already entering the waterline." Reyes nodded slightly. The atmosphere in the clearing had shifted completely now. Even my mother seemed to notice it. Diane had stopped laughing and was watching the agents carefully while still holding her phone up in front of her. I realized then that she had never stopped recording. She had captured everything. Patricia explaining the demolition, my mother discussing the paperwork, the bulldozer tearing through the shoreline. Agent Reyes noticed it too. His eyes moved slowly toward the phone in Diane's hand. "Ma'am," he said calmly, stepping closer to her. "What are you recording?" Diane smiled again, though the confidence behind it looked thinner now. "Just documenting the situation," she replied. "My daughter tends to exaggerate things." Reyes held out his hand. "I'm going to need that phone," he said. For the first time all morning, my mother didn't laugh. Her fingers tightened around the device as Patricia leaned closer to whisper something urgently in her ear. Whatever she said made Diane's smile disappear completely. Reyes didn't move his hand. "Ma'am," he repeated calmly, "please give me the phone." My mother didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the phone as if the small device had suddenly become the most valuable thing she owned. For the first time that morning, the confidence in her expression began to crack. She looked at Patricia instead of the agent, searching her face for direction. "Why would you need my phone?" Diane asked finally, forcing a small laugh that sounded hollow. "I'm just recording a family disagreement." Agent Reyes kept his hand extended, his voice calm and steady. "Because that recording may contain evidence related to an active federal environmental investigation." Patricia stepped forward quickly. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You can't just take someone's phone because you think it might be relevant." Reyes didn't raise his voice. "If the device contains evidence of environmental violations or property fraud connected to federally protected land, it can be collected as part of the investigation." Behind him, one of the other agents was still examining the paperwork Patricia had handed over earlier. I watched him carefully flip through the pages, pausing again at the signature line. My mother's grip on the phone tightened even more. "This is harassment," Patricia continued. "We have a demolition permit and legal documentation. There's no crime here." The agent reviewing the paperwork finally spoke. "Agent Reyes," he said, holding up the document. "You might want to see this." Reyes turned and walked over. The agent pointed directly at the transfer signature printed across the bottom of the page. "The handwriting doesn't match the identification signature on file for the property owner," he explained quietly. Patricia's shoulders stiffened. "That's because signatures vary," she said quickly. "People sign things differently all the time." Reyes studied the page for a moment before glancing toward me. "Ms. Clark, did you sign this transfer?" "No," I said. The word hung in the air for a few seconds. Reyes nodded slowly and handed the document back to the other agent. Meanwhile, my mother was still holding the phone, and suddenly she looked down at the screen. Her thumb began moving quickly. At first, I didn't understand what she was doing. Then it hit me. "She's deleting the video," I said. One of the agents reacted immediately. "Ma'am, stop!" Diane froze, but her thumb was still hovering over the screen. The agent stepped forward and gently but firmly took the phone from her hand. "You cannot tamper with potential evidence during a federal investigation," he said. My mother's face had turned pale. "I wasn't deleting anything," she insisted weakly. The agent glanced at the screen. The video interface was still open, showing the recording that had captured the entire morning. Patricia explaining the demolition, my mother laughing, the bulldozer tearing through the shoreline. He locked the screen and handed the device to Agent Reyes. Reyes looked at it briefly before slipping it into an evidence pouch. "That device will be reviewed as part of this investigation," he said. Patricia's voice rose sharply. "You can't do that." Reyes turned toward her again. "Your demolition activity has already caused visible disturbance to a federally protected wetland," he replied calmly. "Combined with a potentially forged property transfer document and recorded statements regarding the demolition order, there is probable cause to investigate further." The words seemed to drain the last bit of color from Patricia's face. "This is insane," she said. "You're blowing a family dispute completely out of proportion." Behind us, the bulldozer operator stood silently beside his machine, clearly realizing that the situation had spiraled far beyond a normal construction job. Reyes spoke quietly with two of the other agents for a moment. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I caught a few words: forgery, environmental damage, evidence tampering. When they finished, Reyes turned back toward Patricia and my mother. "Based on the evidence currently available," he said calmly, "both of you are being detained while the investigation proceeds." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then one of the agents stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs. Patricia's voice rose in panic. "You can't arrest me over a construction permit." "This is not about the permit," the agent replied. The metallic click of the cuffs closing around Patricia's wrists echoed across the clearing. My mother began shouting immediately, "This is harassment! You can't treat us like criminals!" Another set of handcuffs appeared. Within seconds, both of them were standing beside the federal vehicles, their earlier confidence completely gone. I stood near the wreckage of my cabin, watching the scene unfold in silence. The same bulldozer that had destroyed my house now sat motionless in the clearing, and the family who believed they could take my land with forged paperwork and a machine had just discovered something they clearly never expected. Federal law doesn't care about family arguments. The clearing felt strangely quiet after the federal vehicles drove away. The bulldozer sat idle near the shoreline, its engine cold, its steel tracks still pressed deep into the wet soil beside Alder Creek Lake. The destruction around me suddenly looked even more unreal without the noise and shouting that had filled the morning. Broken cedar beams from my cabin lay scattered across the clearing, and the muddy grooves left by the machine stretched all the way down to the water. Within a few hours, however, the silence didn't last. Local authorities began arriving first to secure the site. Then came environmental inspectors, survey teams, and finally reporters who had somehow already heard what happened. News travels quickly in small communities, especially when something unusual happens near protected land. And this story was more than unusual. By evening, the first news helicopter appeared above the lake, circling slowly while cameras captured aerial footage of the damaged shoreline and the wreckage of the demolished cabin. I stood near the edge of the clearing watching the helicopter move across the sky, realizing that the story had already become public. The next morning, my phone was filled with messages. Colleagues from the television station where I worked had seen the first reports online. Several local outlets had already published short articles describing the federal environmental investigation at Alder Creek Lake. My name wasn't mentioned yet, but it didn't take long for people to connect the location with the property I owned. Over the following weeks, the situation moved quickly from investigation to prosecution. Federal environmental investigators continued examining the damage caused by the bulldozer tracks and the debris that had been pushed toward the shoreline. Environmental scientists documented how the disturbed soil had damaged nesting areas used by migratory birds that returned to the lake each year. The video taken on my mother's phone became one of the most important pieces of evidence. It showed Patricia clearly instructing the bulldozer operator to clear the shoreline for a future construction project. It showed my mother laughing and discussing how the paperwork had been arranged through a contact inside the county planning office. It even captured the moment Patricia explained that the demolition was happening quickly because she believed I would never agree to transfer the land voluntarily. Those words followed them directly into federal court. Several months later, the hearings began. I sat quietly in the courtroom behind the legal teams while prosecutors presented the evidence gathered from the site. The photographs of the wetland damage appeared on large screens. Environmental experts explained the ecological importance of the protected shoreline and how heavy machinery had torn through the habitat. The forged property transfer was also examined carefully. Handwriting specialists compared the signature on the transfer document to multiple samples of my real signature. The difference was obvious even to someone without technical training. Patricia's defense tried to argue that she believed the demolition permit had been properly issued and that she trusted the paperwork provided by the county office. But the video recording made that argument difficult to sustain. The footage showed her discussing the demolition as a deliberate attempt to clear land that still legally belonged to me. My mother faced her own problems in court. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that she had helped arrange the forged documents and that she attempted to delete the recorded video while federal agents were already on the property. What had started as a family conflict over land had turned into a case involving environmental violations, real estate fraud, and evidence tampering. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom remained completely silent. Patricia was found guilty of multiple federal offenses related to environmental damage and fraudulent property transfer. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in federal prison, along with significant financial penalties tied to restoring the damaged wetland habitat. My mother received a 4-year sentence for conspiracy and evidence tampering. The court also ordered extensive environmental restoration along the Alder Creek shoreline. Specialized teams would remove debris from the water, repair damaged wetland vegetation, and stabilize the soil where the bulldozer tracks had carved into the shoreline. The financial penalties alone reached into the millions. Within months, several of the family assets Patricia had once been so proud of were sold to cover the restoration costs and legal fines. The large house she had built with her husband in the city was one of the first to go. I didn't celebrate any of it. I simply watched the consequences unfold quietly, the same way I had watched the bulldozer destroy my cabin that morning. Months later, when the restoration crews finally finished their work, I returned to the property beside Alder Creek Lake. The clearing where my cabin once stood was empty now, but the shoreline looked alive again. New vegetation had begun growing along the wetland, and birds had already returned to the reeds near the water. Standing there in the quiet forest, I realized something my family had never understood. They believed destroying my house would take the land away from me. Instead, it only proved that the land had always been protected by something much stronger than a forged signature. A year later, the forest around Alder Creek Lake looked almost exactly the way it had before the bulldozer arrived. The wetland grasses had grown back along the shoreline, bending gently whenever the wind moved across the water. New reeds filled the muddy areas where the steel tracks once carved deep scars through the soil. If someone had visited the lake for the first time that morning, they probably would not have guessed that a construction machine had nearly destroyed part of the protected shoreline. I stood near the edge of the water and watched a pair of herons glide slowly across the surface of the lake. The early morning sun reflected off the water in soft silver lines, the same way it used to when I sat on the porch of the old cabin drinking coffee before sunrise. The porch was gone, of course. The original cabin had been completely demolished that day. The insurance payout and the legal settlement from the environmental case helped cover some of the loss, but the place I had built with my own hands could never truly be replaced. For a long time, I believed the land would always remind me of what had happened there. But something changed during the months that followed. Instead of abandoning the property, I decided to rebuild. Not the same house and not in the same place. When the restoration crews finished repairing the wetland damage, I worked with a group of architects who specialized in sustainable design. The new structure would sit farther back from the shoreline, raised slightly above the ground so that rainwater could move naturally through the soil beneath it. Solar panels would power most of the house, and reclaimed wood from nearby mills would replace the cedar beams that once formed the walls of my cabin. Construction took almost a full year. When the project was finally finished, the new house stood quietly among the trees, blending into the forest in a way that felt even more natural than the original cabin had. From the porch, I could see the same stretch of lake where the bulldozer once pushed debris into the water. Now the shoreline looked untouched again. Sometimes people ask me if I feel anger when I think about what happened that morning. The truth is more complicated than that. Losing the cabin hurt deeply, and the betrayal from my own family was something I never expected. But the outcome of everything that followed taught me something important. My mother and sister believed they could take the land simply by creating the right paperwork and bringing in a machine to erase what I had built. They assumed that family pressure would keep me quiet long enough for the transfer to become permanent. They never considered the one detail that changed everything. The law protecting that shoreline was stronger than anything they could forge. Today, the forest around Alder Creek is quiet again. Birds return every spring. The wetland grasses move with the wind exactly the way they did before the bulldozer arrived. The land survived everything that happened. And so did I. Sometimes when I sit on the porch in the early morning light, I think about how different things might have been if I had simply walked away that day. If I had stayed silent to avoid conflict. If I had allowed the destruction to continue just because the people responsible shared my last name. Instead, one phone call changed everything. And if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that protecting what you've worked for isn't wrong, even when the people standing against you happen to be family. If you were in my position that morning, watching someone destroy something you spent years building, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have made that same phone call? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about real-life justice, difficult family choices, and moments when the truth finally comes out, consider subscribing to the channel and staying with us for the next story. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.